Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I want to talk about journaling on black paper. So many of us have those black pages in our art journals, but sometimes it can be hard to know how to use them and how to use them well. So today I want to share with you a few things that I use on these black pages to add dimension and variety to my art journaling practice. So let's get started. So when we're using black cardstock or black tags, one thing to think about is what inks work well with this. I would generally say use an ink that has a chalk base or something like these distress oxide inks. They're not necessarily chalk ink, but they kind of react and work similarly to a chalk ink, which is why they're my favorite for using them on black backgrounds. You also can use things like white pens. Paint pens are also really good for this because they do stand out against the black background. One thing I would not use are distress inks that are just straight distress, not the distress oxide. They're more translucent and you won't be able to see them properly on the black tag. So we're looking at adding color to our black background. You want to think a lot about what you're using for ink. When you're looking at the distress ink versus the Wilted Violet distress oxide ink, even though the same color of ink, they'll react very differently to the surface. So the distress ink itself, if you add it to it, you basically see nothing. Maybe a very slight change, but it really doesn't do anything for you. Part of that is these inks are translucent, so it's not going to work properly on a black background. Well, these distress oxide inks, if you add them, you will see that you are getting some color. And as they dry, you will see them a little bit better. But again, this is where you need to think about how deep the color you're using is, because this is a fairly deep purple. If I want to move to something that is a little bit lighter, for example, this shaded lilac, when we add it on there, now you're seeing like how vibrant that color is. And again, the lighter colors will always work better than the darker colors, even with the distress oxide inks, even though they will work on using a darker color, you're going to get more variation and you're going to get more vibrance by using a lighter color. And if you want to take this a little bit further, we can go for a color like Speckled Egg. Speckled Egg is a very light color. And this Speckled Egg Distress Oxide is even more brilliant on the black paper. So the color really does make a difference, and just the shade makes a big difference on just what kind of final result you're going to get on your tag. And so my favorites are to use the Distress Oxide inks for this. I know some people have chalk inks. There's other things that you could use. I also would say you can use paint markers. You can use acrylic paints. There's also other things you can do on black, but today I wanted to really focus on inks and pens more so. And in that case, I really wanted to show you this effect and what it means for your projects. So I'm just grabbing another tag here, and I'm going to use a stencil, and I'm going to add some color through this stencil. So in this case, I'm going to go through with some of the shaded lilac. Just adding it through that tag. Just moving that circular motion. And I'm actually going to add some speckled egg onto this as well. And this is where, compared to my video a couple weeks ago where I was using white paper, where you could get a lot of really intricate blends, a lot of these are not going to get quite the same blend on the black as you would with the regular Distress Oxide inks on white. Again, that black really kind of sucks in the color. So something to be really aware of when you're trying to do this, that there's certain colors going to work better together, and there's other colors that are just going to kind of just fade away. And I'm going to try some squeezed lemonade as well on this. There you go. So you can see that because I was using both like blue and purple, they were a little bit of a cooler color, so you can't really see a huge difference between them. But once you start adding the yellow in, now you're starting to get a more interesting blend. And again, it's a lot more subtle than using more conventional colors of distress ink on white paper. But even there, you see a little bit of the yellow, the purple, the blue, and it just really makes a nice blend of color. So now that you have your ink down, then the question is, where do you want to go to next with this? In this case, I'm going to start by adding some jelly pen. I wanted to show you a few different things that will work on top of the Distress Oxide ink. And this is a Pentel Milky Pop pen. I find the gel pens, they can work pretty well on these surfaces. But sometimes I like going a little bit thicker with what is on my surface. So there's other options. You can find the jelly rolls. They come in like size 5, size 10, and size 8. So if you want to go for a white pen, I really like the jelly roll pens, and you can get quite a thick line. From these jelly roll pens. But I find sometimes, I don't know if it's just with the ink on the surface, and maybe I just need to let this dry a little bit longer. I am doing this right after I put ink down, which maybe is part of the problem. But you're noticing that you are getting a line, but it's not quite as consistent. So if you want a slightly more consistent line, that's where I would maybe choose a paint pen. And especially these Posca paint pens have very good coverage. So they're kind of my go-to when I'm adding things on top of ink. Ink will work well with ink on top of it, but I find sometimes I like going with a paint or something else just because you end up usually getting a slightly better result. And it's a little bit more vibrant as well. And I find especially if you want to outline anything on a stencil that is a circle, put your stencil back down and add your color on top. Trying to freehand a perfect circle is very challenging. And I can tell I'm moving too fast because there's some areas here I've actually ended up having my paint pen splatter, and that has more to do with me moving too quickly, and it's just grabbing the edges of the stencil and making little marks. And again, you don't have to only stick to white. I also have this Posca light blue paint pen. And this Posca light blue paint pen also does a really nice job of adding some of these circles to your surface. And with this one being more of that little pen nib, I find that it does transfer a little bit better and doesn't get caught on the edges as much as the more bullet style one, like this one. And so I did a lot of the holes. I did some of the circles. I didn't necessarily do all the circles. So now this is where you can go in on spaces like here where maybe the ink went underneath. You can just fix those edges. But you can see it's been transferring quite well onto the surface. And this is also where often I will go in, and I showed this a little bit in my video a couple weeks ago, which is like add your own patterns. This is where you can have a lot of fun just going in and kind of coming up with different patterns you would like to see on your circles, and just add your own little take on it. The idea is to add whatever patterns you feel like it. There's lots of patterns out there. You can find a lot of things online. But this is just one way that you can just add doodles and variations to what you're already doing in your projects. But you can see this is usually working pretty well. I feel like I'm getting a little bit of staining from the color below. What I have found with a lot of these inks, when you're adding other color on top, even with a paint pen, especially with a white paint pen, I've noticed that sometimes you will get a slight discoloration in your paint. It's not too bad with this because I chose more blue colors, but I think when you use things with more of a red tone, I've run into where things turn out quite yellow. And actually, I'll just grab my sample, because this sample I was playing around with a little bit earlier today, and you'll notice in here, this looks really quite yellow. That was originally white. That's all white pen. So what I realized is that when you're with this background, I chose reds and oranges and yellows, and now I'm noticing all those yellow hues are coming through. But with this one, I feel like there's a little bit in here that's going a little bit more gray, but overall the color is quite a bit better. So it might be something to think about when you're doing this. Think about what kind of ink you're going to put down and what kind of pen you want to put over top, and try to find something that's complementary so it doesn't yellow or look strange when you add your other color. I'm just going to add a little bit more to this background or this tag, and then I will just show you how you can add additional layers on top. I do find sometimes my paint pens will get a little bit more clogged using the ink below. So this is something to watch for, and just shake them up really well as you go, and hopefully that will solve some of the problem. So let's say you're pretty happy with how the background looks. You like all your doodling, it's working really well. In this case, I'm finding that with getting the blues in there instead of the yellow, it's looking way less yellow than this particular tag looked. But I also want to show you how you could add some of those stars on top. So in this case, I'm just going to be using just this paint pen. I'm just going to outline it. And you just want to fill it in where you can with the white. And then from there you can start looking at adding some highlights and some other things. Again, this is working quite a bit better than when I was using more yellows and reds. The yellows and reds were turning this very yellow. Instead, it's kind of keeping this to the cooler blue side, and doesn't seem to be giving me quite as much trouble. And part of that is I also chose lighter inks. And I wonder if part of it too is just the amount of color in the ink itself, that perhaps it's just not having as much trouble being picked up, and instead it's kind of staying on the surface instead of being picked up by the pen. I'm also noticing I am getting a little bit of the yellow kind of coming through there. So it seems to be one of the things about using the Oxide inks is you're going to get a little tiny bit of yellowing when you're using it with your white pen, but that doesn't have to be a big issue. So what I decided to do here is I'm now going to add in some metallic blue. This is an Artistro paint pen, and I've been having pretty good luck with these. When I did a paint pen comparison a little while ago, I had someone message me going, well, you didn't try these pens. I'm like, oh, well, I should. And when I actually tried them, I went, oh, these work pretty well. And they're a little bit more reasonable price point than the Poscas and some of these art ones. Again, I don't know how much pigment they have in them compared to some of the other paint pens, but if you're working in a journal, on a card, or in a place that's not going to get a lot of light, it really doesn't matter too much. If you're looking at adding it on a canvas, I would say stick with the pens that are known for having a lot of really high pigment. It's going to be more light fast and it's going to work a lot better. So there you go. If you want to add another image on top, and you can see some of the color underneath is still coming through. So the other option is you go a lot darker with these colors as well. You could also, you either like it the way it is, or you could just add other colors and other layers. In this case, I'm going to try to outline it with this kind of copper color. This is another way of just adding a little bit of highlight, pulling it up from the surface, helping it stick out a little bit. And that can be just enough to just pull that out. And if you feel like that sticks out too much, the other option is then you start adding highlights in the center here. And these highlights can just help kind of bring the star colors back in. And so it doesn't also seem like, well, what's with the weird border on it? Instead, now it's highlights in your star. So let's say you don't have the Distress Oxides, or you don't want to start with a Distress Oxide base because you don't like the way it maybe affects your pens, or maybe the way it sits together. The other option is just, again, use your stencil and just draw the circles through the stencil like I had done before. Now you have some options. You can decide where you want to go with this next. One thing I like to do if you're not into doodling is stamping through the stencil with a stamp. And how I like to do that is, in this case, I'm taking this cursive stamp and I'm adding some white ink on top. In this case, I'm using this Picket Fence Distress ink. The Distress ink is white and you can actually see it on the surface when you stamp it on black. So in this case, I'm just going to take it. And you want to press hard because it does have to get through that stencil onto the surface below. You can see in some areas I had a better stamp than others, but that's okay. It's okay that they're not perfect. I actually kind of prefer them when they're not. And then you want to make sure that this area here, I've chose not to add any circles. So you just want to make sure that when you're stamping this, you're kind of keeping in mind where your circles begin and end. This is a really simple technique for adding a little bit more script. It's another way you can use your stamps and your stencils together. So when I pull that up, you can see where you have all those fun little bits of script in places. And I'm not going to just leave it there because I think we can take this a little bit further. I have this Adventure Stand set and it has all these small little pieces of wood. And now what I'm going to do is go in with some broken china. In this case, I'm just letting it stick to my finger. And I'm just going to stamp it down. And so you can see on those particular ones, it's the right size to end up with a really fun texture. In some cases, I'm doing the texture with the cursive writing underneath it as well. And then the other option is you can look at using these little border pieces that I also have. And just use your finger and just stamp it on. And if you want to go back to using a little bit of the white, you can go back. Again, add a little bit more white in some of these areas. And there's no reason you can't have more than one pattern in a particular bubble or a circle. And I actually also have these little leaves. I'm going to add a few of those in there too. So you can make almost like tiny little scenes within each of those bubbles, which can be a really fun way of just mixing things up a little bit. In this case, I'm stamping a bunch. I love where this is going, but now I actually want to add a few of my own doodles as well. And the reason I was trying to do it on a tag like this is, again, you can see the possibility of how you could use this in a journal. Adding one layer, adding lots of different layers, having ink over areas, having ink under areas. Really, it comes down to wherever your imagination goes about how far you really want to take this. And I don't really want it all looking the same. And that's why I'm kind of coming in with the pen and starting to add a few doodles. Keeps things from being all similar. Add dots around the edges. Add little bits of frames. This just gives you a few examples of how you could totally use this in your own projects. So to finish this off, I'm going to use the same quote that I used a couple weeks ago. I find that sometimes you find a quote that you particularly like and use it over and over and over again. And this one says, "Let your feet wander, your eyes marvel, and your soul ignite." And I feel like that's just such a nice little saying. So what I'm going to do is actually just take some paint pen here. I would generally just use a brayer and add paint to my stamping surface, but I'm being a little bit lazy and I wanted to show you just another way you can use your paint pens, especially if you don't have a brayer and you're not comfortable using a ton of paint on your surface. Give this a try. It's a really simple way of just adding paint to your stamp. What's neat about this is you can actually use a second color and come in and add it in areas, because you're just adding it straight to the stamp. You could choose some different colors as well. I'm trying to work quite quickly because I don't really want the paint to dry on my stamp. Just going to stamp that in my spot there. I'm going to press that very hard just to get a really good transfer of paint onto your surface. And that did not work. So yeah, I tried stamping and that completely didn't work. When I stamped this one earlier, I did get it to transfer. So I think what I ended up doing was just leaving it too long. As I was talking, I just let it dry a little bit too much. So what happens when this happens? Because this is another opportunity. How are we going to fix this and how are we going to make it look good again? So I'm just going to take this little piece of paper. I'm going to clean my stamp really well because now I have paint stuck on it. And I'm going to stamp onto my surface here. And we're just going to use some black ink. So then once you get that on your surface, then the next thing you want to do is figure out what kind of shape you want to cut it out in. I would actually like to make this a bit of a circular shape. So what I'm going to do is grab my gesso bottle and just trace around this. I'm using the 6H pencil, so it's going to be quite light. But really, you can use really any circular object that you have. That's going to give you a decent shape. So I've cut out my sentiment, and I realized when I stamped it, I didn't stamp it perfectly straight. So I'm just going to add some adhesive to the back, and I'm going to straighten it up just along this edge here. And it's going to cut off the excess, and that will help it be a little bit straighter than it would have been. And I feel like I could use a little bit of an edge to it, just so it doesn't stick out as much. But this is where having the white and the blue together really works, because then this doesn't seem really out of place. And I'm just going to add just a little bit of an edge with the paint pen. And let's say you actually wanted to add a little bit of the ink back in here. Just go in with your stencil. And let's say you want one of these guys here to have a little bit more color. So you just need to find one with a similar shape. And you can always just add a tiny bit of the speckled egg and just add it in a few little places. If you'd like to have that having a little bit more ink and be a little bit softer. Again, there's so many different ways you can go about this for adding ink and paint to your layouts. But this is just one example, just one way that you can look at adding a few different layers of ink, few different layers of paint, and this is how you can get these really effective looking backgrounds just on black paper. Because black paper isn't necessarily hard, you just need to learn how to use it, what materials work well and which ones don't. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today and learned a new way of using your black paper that's in your journals and in other projects. You'll notice today that I did use a tag over an art journal, and the reason for that is just for good pacing for this video. Really, the idea is that it's a sample of an idea that you could be using on a canvas, in an art journal, on a scrapbooking page, in a card. There's a variety of ways of using this technique in your projects. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. Also, I would love to hear your questions and your comments. Please leave them below, and I do reply to all of the comments that I do receive. I hope that you give my website a look as well. It's hopalongstudio.com. There I have other ideas on how to build a creative habit in your own life. It's also a place where I include the photo and written instructions for each of these tutorials. I hope you have a great week, that you take some time for self-care, and I will see you next time.